Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumEtSpes22.com, Podbean podcast and YouTube video. Super excited to be doing this today because I haven't done a podcast now in weeks because I've been in Rome covering first Pope Francis's funeral, then the conclave, now the post-conclave stuff. I won't be home until around May 23rd or something like that. And so I'm really happy to kind of get back in the saddle here and do one of these podcasts. Unfortunately, I'm not in my home with my fancy condenser microphone and my iMac, so possibly the video and the audio will not be completely up to the normal standards, but we'll try to muddle through. The other reason I'm excited today is we're doing another one in my series of articles on the various authors with articles in the journal Communio International Catholic Review. I am on the editorial board of Communio, and somehow or another they have anointed me their official podcaster. How I got that, I do not know, but I'm very happy to do so. Today, I am joined by none other than Mr. Samuel Korb, and I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit more, but just in a nutshell, he is a doctoral student in the theology program at the University of Notre Dame, my wife's alma mater, by the way. I am married to a domer. And so welcome, Samuel.
Thank you, Larry.
Yes. Uh, so we're going to be discussing, this is the issue of Communio right here. It's the latest issue. It's the general theme is the Council of Nicaea, and it is the winter 2024 issue of Communio. And your article is entitled As Ointment Emptied Out, Origen and Intratrinitarian Kenosis. Now that sounds like a mouthful,
It is, yeah.
but it's a topic, the topic of is having written on Font Balthasar in my own dissertation and did scholarly work on Font Balthasar, I am obviously going to be keenly interested in the topic of kenosis. So before we dig into the article, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you originally from Indiana? If not, where are you from? How did you find your way to Notre Dame?
Sure, yeah. So I'm originally from St. Louis. And then I came to Notre Dame by way of the University of Dallas, where I did my undergraduate studies. And then I did a master's at Notre Dame, and now I'm in the PhD program. I am preparing, not quite to the point yet, but preparing to write a dissertation. I'm in systematic theology on Eric Shavara and his understanding of analogy, which of course is related closely to Balthasar. Specifically as it is built up against Hegel and Hegelian dialectic. So how analogy relates to
Okay, so the
dialectic.
million-dollar question is who are you working with? John Betts or Cyril
Yes, of
Origen?
course. Well, Cyril is involved in a big way, of course. John is my formal advisor,
Okay.
and of course, his knowledge of Shabara is unmatched. Um, and so this article is not exactly on that, but you can kind of see how those concerns or those interests are reflected. So, of course, you have the Balthasarian element, which is, I mean, he's a student of Shabara. He learned a lot from
Yeah.
Shabara. Of course, he's not identical with Shabara. Um, but the Balthasarian element is there. And of course, the question of Trinitarian kenosis is in some way, in a way to be sorted out in different ways by different people related to Hegel. Um, and so I sort of posed the question in a patristic mode, seeing what we could find. And the person I landed upon was Origen, which is another author that Balthasar was very interested in, of course. And
Yeah.
in one little quip he has in his a little book on Balthasar, he actually compares him to Hegel. So all those questions and concerns are constellated in various ways and somehow came together into this piece. I'm not I'm not a petrologist. I'm not in patristics formally. I try to do systematic theology in a mode which is always in touch with the tradition and always in the same way that Balthasar and Shabar are doing in a ressourcement mode. And somehow I found a way to write something at least halfway coherent so that Communio would publish it. Maybe it's more than halfway coherent. Maybe we can work that out together, which poses this very modern speculative theological concern in a historical, patristic, specifically Origenian way.
Well, I have to say, then you are a bit of a Wunderkind because here you have already an article published in a prestigious journal like Communio, and you haven't even started the dissertation process yet. So that bodes well for your potential employment future, I think.
And
A,
hopefully,
a PhD from Notre Dame and already publishing in prestigious journals, and it is more than a coherent article. I immediately when the managing editor, William Hammett, sent it to me. He sent me a list of potential articles and authors and their emails. I immediately zeroed in on yours simply because, yeah, as a Balthasarian, I am interested in how the concept of intratrinitarian kenosis played out. Because, yeah, Balthasar did engage Hegel and so on with this question. I also think that it really is at the heart of ressourcement theology's attempt sort of to deal with the modernist crisis, with the issues that they raised of historicity and immanence versus transcendence and so on. So all of that, plays into this. So I was very, very interested in the topic. But before we delve in, oh, by the way, too, I thought, well, this is a really good example of ressourcement communio theology because it's an attempt to develop ideas in the patristic tradition that aren't necessarily completely in line with the Thomistic tradition.
mhm.
And you do mention in your article that Balthasar and others have been criticized by the Thomists. But before we get into all of that, let's back up a little bit. If you don't mind, enlighten my viewers, my listeners, who was Origen? Most of my listeners might, or some of them might think, well, he's that universalist dude who castrated himself, so why should we listen to him? But both of those accusations are rather dubious, I think. But anyway, who was Origen?
Yeah, Origen was a born late second century, thrived in the third century, theologian, Alexandrian. Um, his place in the history of theology is very contested. He, in his own day, you could say, many would, that he was the first Christian systematic theologian. So his primary systematic text, if we can use that language, is De Principiis on first principles.
Yes.
Here he begins just by laying out the rule of faith as he understands it. This is what all Christians understand and believe to be true. And then he develops that rule of faith and seeks to understand it for the rest of the four books of the text. So in that way, it's a piece of speculative systematic theology. It begins with the rule of faith and then moves toward an understanding of it. He's most famous, though, for his biblical interpretation, his biblical hermeneutics. So book 4 of De Prin is on biblical hermeneutics. How do Christians read the Bible? And he has just a vast array of literature, of sermons and commentaries on the Bible. His commentary on the Gospel of John, which was written on one hand as a direct exegesis of John, and on the other hand against a seemingly Gnostic or Valentinian, he calls him Valentinian, interpreter named Heracleon. So that's one of the primary texts that I was working on with this article, because he speaks about kenosis in a handful of places there, and in one very important place. So he's very important for directly interpreting scripture in many ways. He's important for responding to Gnostic and Valentinian versions of Christianity in his day. He's always seen as someone engaging with contemporary philosophy. He seems to have been a classmate, potentially, of Plotinus under Ammonius Saccas. I don't know if that's true. Some people say it's not. But it's an interesting legend, if it is a legend, that he's always been seen as someone engaging the regnant philosophy of his day. So he's doing a million different things in this early third century and became a standard theological interlocutor for everyone after him. In Greek patristics, you see Cappadocians interacting with him. Alexandrians like Cyril are always working and with the legacy of Origen, Maximus too. In the West, you have lots of controversies about Origen. Augustine, Jerome, Rufinus, they're grappling with his legacy. And then there are, yeah, you mentioned the castration rumors and the fact that he's not a saint. Is he a universalist? These are interesting questions. De Lubac has an interesting article on the castration question. It doesn't seem to be true. I didn't think I'd be talking about that today, so I'm not.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't mean to throw you a red herring, but I just toss it out there because that's, in terms of viewership, listenership, that is, these are common themes about
Hmm.
Origin that are simply out there
Yeah.
in the ether. And before we get to your article, I mean, the main source of our historical knowledge of Origin is the church historian Eusebius. And, he was writing sort of long after Origen's life, and Origen had strong supporters and strong detractors. So therefore, the historical remembrances are sometimes littered with apocryphal tales, both pro and
Hmm.
con. And the castration tale seems to be false as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And it's also unclear as to whether or not Origen was, in fact, a strict dogmatic universalist. He was
Hmm.
condemned, Origenism or whatever, or certain principles associated with Origen were condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople. But, it's unclear as to, like in Humane Generis, De Lubac might have been in Pius XII's mind when those propositions were condemned, but the question of whether or not de Lubac actually held any of those propositions is another matter entirely. Same with Origen. Anyway, I'm talking too much. Let's get to your article. Um, so it's about intratrinitarian kenosis. So first off, please describe what do we, obviously it's grounded in Paul's great hymn in Philippians, so we can sort of begin
Hmm.
there.
Yeah. So the basic theological question of intratrinitarian kenosis is consequence of kenosis in the general sense. So if listeners aren't familiar with the Greek term kenosis, it just means emptying. It comes from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, where he says that Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Um, and then the question that a lot of modern theologians ask, preeminently Balthasar among Catholics, Sergius Bulgakov was an important precedent to Balthasar and a source for Balthasar. He's a Russian Orthodox thinker, although Balthasar and he are not identical. The question for these theologians is, can we say something? Can we say that self-emptying of the Son in the economy, that is, in the world, in the incarnation, and in his human life, is that indicative of something about God's inner life, the intratrinitarian life? So
Right.
that's the significance of the term intratrinitarian. Can we speak of a kenosis or a self-emptying within the Trinity, independent of the economic emptying or economic kenosis in the incarnation? And Balthasar wants to say, yes, there's something in the Trinity, a kind of anticipation or presupposition of the incarnation, of the kenotic incarnation, or the incarnational kenosis, rather, in the Father's generation of the Son as a kind of self-emptying. Um, so that's the question, and there's a lot of literature that's been written on this recently. Um, you, of course, have had numerous episodes on the subject, so I would encourage all listeners to go listen to those. They're probably know more than I. But when you look at all this literature, and there's a variety of perspectives. So, as I mentioned, Bulgakov and Balthasar aren't identical. Grappling with the legacy of Hegel is in there. I would refer listeners to Cyril Regan's work on Balthasar and Hegel, where he talks about the differences between Balthasar and Hegel on kenosis. I have those in the footnotes in the article, if
Is
you want to
that the
find them.
Anatomy of Misremembering?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and
that
there
that
are,
that's a massive tome, but it's well worth reading.
it is, yeah, and I at least I hope I put in the article the precise page numbers. Um,
You did.
Forgive me if I didn't.
No, I have them
Uh,
all underlined, so I can go
oh,
back
good.
and look
Yeah.
them up.
But there's a variety of perspectives on this. And as I mentioned, a lot of people, preeminently Thomist thinkers. I mentioned the article Thomas Joseph White, who came out with a book on a Thomistic theology of the Trinity just a couple years ago. He takes some issue with this. Bruce Marshall had written about this before. Father White had written on it before this large book too. Um, and they have concerns. What's interesting about all of this literature is that it's very speculative, which is the primary mode in which Trinitarian theology really should happen, of course. Um, but B, when it's engaging with theologians in the tradition, is doing so almost exclusively, if not exclusively, with modern thinkers. So I mentioned these Hegel, Bulgakov, and Balthasar is the most important. And Balthasar, of course, is related to Adrian von Speyer. And my advisor, John Betts, has an article on this where he tries to bring in Shivara. So we're trying to correlate a lot of different modern thinkers. So I just, out of curiosity, wondered if we could reframe or just frame the question in a less modern and a more patristic way. Are there resources within the patristic theological tradition where we can approach this question and understand it better, perhaps? So I answered that yes. I turned to Origen. The goal is very modest, so I'm not trying to provide a knockdown answer to the question. Reading my article is in no way a replacement for reading all those other thinkers that I mentioned. They're the ones who are really going to provide the speculative theological proposals for how to understand this. I was just struck by the fact that in this literature, we don't really ask the question to the fathers. So I was trying to do this more in a ressourcement mode. Balthasar does Mysterium Pascale and other texts pull out from the tradition, but I was wondering if we could do it in a more sustained way. And when you ask the question to the patristic tradition, do any of these theologians have an understanding of intratrinitarian kenosis? The answer is no, right? So this is a modern question. They did not pose it. So we have to do something very subtle hermeneutically and hopefully not violent. And that's to really study, I focus on Origen, his Christology and his Trinitarian theology to see if we can pull out resources for trying to answer this question, knowing that he didn't pose the question himself and that to do this, to ask this question in this way is potentially misleading or dangerous, and it could abuse Origen's text. These are all provisos. I hope I didn't do that, but just to state the question in that way
Yeah.
is important at the outset, I think.
Well, you accomplished all those things. I want to tell the readers too. Your article is not extremely long, maybe
Hmm.
15 pages or so, so it's easily readable. It's also got the virtue of being very focused, very on a single topic that you really unpack in a very logical way. So there aren't a lot of tributaries and sidebar conversations. So that's another thing that I really liked about the article. By the way, you mentioned John Betts. He has an article in the new Ressourcement Journal of Word on Fire called The Analogy of Tradition Toward a More Radical Ressourcement,
Right.
which talks of the humility of God. And
Hmm.
in his book, too, his latest book, he has a whole chapter, beautiful chapter on the humility of God and this
Hmm.
issue. In Balthasar, he speaks of this Kenosis. Now, you just said, and I really like this about the article, which is you're very careful not to do violence anachronistically to what it was that Origen really said, because as you say at the beginning, okay, the Greek word kenosis means simply emptying, descent, those sorts of things. But for Origen, sort of given his Platonic, Middle Platonic sort of frame of mind, there's no way that he would just flat out say, yes, there is this Urkenosis, well, I wouldn't use German, but that there is this
Hmm.
Urkenosis within God. Because for Origen, kenosis denotes sort of limitation.
Right.
And there can't be limitation within God. Therefore, you have to do detective work, and you
Hmm.
show that even if he doesn't use this language of intratrinitarian kenosis, he uses the concept. He very clearly sort of makes the concept clear. So maybe you could unpack that a little
Hmm.
bit for us now. How does Origen equate the economic kenosis of the word into the humanity of Jesus? How is
Hmm.
that a reflection of the sort of emanation of the Father's divinity into the Son?
Right. So I think we can say for Origen that the incarnational kenosis is a reflection of something in the inner Trinitarian life. He has language in De Prin and in the commentary on John where he seems to suggest this. And I'm trying to figure out exactly what he means by it. And the key is what I put in the title of the article. So, as ointment emptied out. So, kenosis, emptying, typically you'd think it immediately denotes some kind of loss or privation. When you empty something, it was once full and now it's empty. And those connotations of loss and emptying in the straightforward sense uh, don't seem to apply neatly to the Trinity, certainly not for Origen. But Origen, especially in his commentary on the Song of Songs, doesn't always focus on those elements of loss and depletion and limitation. Rather, he notes that when you empty a bottle of ointment, or perfume, the perfume is spread out. So as ointment emptied out, the emphasis isn't upon loss or depletion; it's on diffusion. How the ointment is spread out into the air and then communicated to what's around it. And so Origen has this way of speaking about the sun self-emptying, not exclusively in terms of loss and depletion, but actually paradoxically in terms of filling. So, in that way, if kenosis indicates filling and emptying into, then it seems to have some kind of resonance with the Trinitarian processions. And specifically, the question is in the Father's generation of the Son. So, if we understand kenosis less in terms of emptying and depletion, more in terms of diffusion and communication, then clearly we have some kind of basis on which to compare it and to see it anticipated, non identically, of course, in the Trinity, where you have the Father's generation of the Son, which Origen uses a variety of images to describe, such as mind and word. So he has the psychological imagery as the mind, or mind and word, and mind and an act of will. This is a kind of emanationist, productive image. He, of course, has father and son. Father gives his nature to his son. He has light and radiance too. Radiance just emanates from the light. So, insofar as both the Father's generation of the Son and the Son's incarnation, self emptying, have these notes of filling, of communication, of expression, we can draw some kind of comparison between them and see how, even though Origin doesn't say it, in some way, and in a way that needs to be defined further, the intratrinitarian act of the Father's generation of the Son is in a kind of anticipation or prefiguring or ground for the possibility of the Son's own self-emptying.
Yes, that was you took the words out of my mouth. That what you're I think what you're trying to say is that in origin, the Father's emanation of his divinity from all eternity to the Son is the ground of possibility for the Son's kenotic descent into our human nature.
Right.
By the way, the perfume analogy has a scriptural uh,
Hmm.
foundation, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's in his commentary on the Song of Songs. I've
Right.
got the notes in here. Um,
It's a beautiful analogy.
it is, yes. So one of my professors, John Cavadini, says that when you look for a text during class or in an occasion like this, by rule, you never find it,
That's
even
true.
though even though it's a pretty short article. Um,
Yeah, let me see if I can dredge it up while we'll both be looking for it here at the same time. Uh, let's see here. Okay.
yes, so it's on page 694
So
in
yeah, for the
Communio.
sake of Young's, okay, go ahead.
Right. So this is Origen's commentary on the Song of Songs, Book 1, Section 4. Says, for the sake of these young souls, therefore, in their growing and abundant life, he who was in the form of God emptied himself. This is the important part now, that
Good.
his name might be as ointment emptied out, and that he might no longer dwell only in light unapproachable and abide in the form of God, but that he might be made flesh. So this is invoking Song of Songs 1:3. Your name is as ointment emptied out, the kenoten, which it comes from the verb kenao, which is what St. Paul uses in
Yes.
Philippians. So your name is as ointment emptied out. Therefore, the maidens have loved you, have they drawn you. Origen interprets this Christologically. Your name as ointment emptied out is the Son emptying himself and becoming man. And so that's the biblical language that Origen is latching upon and interpreting in a Christological way. And as I read him, allowing us, even if he doesn't say it directly, to see a connection between the Son's kenosis and the Father's generation of the Son.
All right. I'm going to, along those lines on page 692, I'm going to quote you back to yourself here.
Sure.
He goes, that kenosis might bear a deeper material similarity to the Father's generation is suggested by Origen's phrasing in the passage above. You had quoted a passage. By this very emptying, per ipsam sui, emptying out, to display to us the fullness of the Godhead, end quote. That intensive ipsam suggests that the kenosis itself is wrapped within the Son's identity as image of the Father's substance and not simply a means by which he becomes the image of the Father's substance. This is a key point here,
Mhm.
that Christ isn't just play acting here. He's not just, in a sense, holographically projecting something of what God is like without really being touched by it. No, it is precisely in his descent into a human nature, becoming a human being, per ipsam, in itself, that reflects the substance of the Father's emanation.
Mhm. Yeah, and that passage, so by this very emptying to display to us the fullness of the Godhead, that's from De Principiis. He has a very similar, even more striking formulation in the commentary on John. So it's that correlation of the Son's emptying as a sign of the fullness of his Godhead. So the emptying is a sign of his divinity. That's the that's the interesting feature. And that's what authorizes a deeper look to do that detective work, as you mentioned, and see if we can correlate his Christology and Trinitarian theology in this way.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is key, that it's precisely in this descent that he is imaging God. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore, there can be no doubt that even if he doesn't use the language of kenosis to describe the intratrinitarian relations, he's clearly saying that the descent, the kenosis, reflects that. Now, however, he doesn't mean to say that it's a strict univocal similarity in the two forms of pouring out. The
Mm-hmm.
Father's emanation has a certain priority, right? And therefore, the the similarity between the two forms of kenosis is analogical.
Yeah. Yeah. So certainly the Father has the ontological priority, and it's the Son who's imaging the Father and not the other way around. Um, and so I've spoken of the similarities, and yeah, you're absolutely right. It cannot be equated directly. We're speaking about something analogous here. So I've indicated the similarities. There are also the dissimilarities, which I think we indicated earlier. For Origen, kenosis does, despite his paradoxical use of the image in a plenary way, in a way that indicates filling and fullness, it still does indicate limitation and loss to an extent. So to what extent? Um, Origen is, of course, very careful not to say that there's anything like there's no substantial change in the incarnation. This is, of course, standard patristic fare. But Origen is at such an early point that this is very noteworthy. He's one of the first theologians to really consider this problem. And of course, Celsus, his philosophical opponent against whom he wrote the Contra Celsum,
Dr. Kelsis.
thinks that the Christian idea of the incarnation does indicate change in God, and therefore it's unintelligible. So he's very concerned to A, uphold the reality of the incarnation, as you were just saying, while B, not ascribing change to God. So how does he do that? Well, he makes a distinction between nature and condition. He says the Son's nature doesn't change, but his condition does, or it undergoes, I use the language of renovation or innovation, which is language from
Yeah.
Maximus the Confessor, just because all these patristic theologians, they're never going to use the word change. That's something that they will always avoid when they're talking about God and something intradivine. But Origen against Celsus says there's no natural alteration here. What changes is the Son's condition. Now he exists humanly while still remaining divine. And so for Origen, that is really what kenosis means. It is that renovation of the mode of his existing. I think you can put it more clearly if you use the language of Maximus the Confessor. Many centuries later, as I mentioned earlier, he is one of the major theologians dealing with the legacy of Origenism. He wrote extensively against Origenism. How exactly that relates to Origen is perplexing and not my job to figure out. But he makes this distinction between logos and tropos. So logos, the logos or the ratio in Latin, it would be of nature, stays the same, while the tropos, the mode of the existing, is innovated. The mode exists in a new way. And so for Maximus, the divine nature exists, or the divine Son exists humanly in the incarnation and not just divinely. I think Origen is getting at something very similar. And for Origen, what this change of condition means is that the limitations belonging to humanity, of corporeality, of living a human life, and of course of dying, the Son makes his own in the incarnation. And that's what kenosis means as a change of condition, not of nature, and an appropriation of the limitations that belong to humanity, which truly are the Son's own humanity, and not, as you said earlier, a kind of play acting.
Yeah, I mean,
So if
go ahead.
well, so yeah, so if kenosis, while having a very interesting that interesting imagery of filling, correlate to the emptying, while it still has that, it does indicate a limitation, kind of appropriation of limitation, and an alteration of condition, though not of nature. And those latter elements, the changing condition or the renovation of condition and the limitation, those are not elements which Origen ever considers happening in God, so to speak. And so from the strict Origenian perspective, we have a very stark and interesting similarity, as I indicated earlier, where the Son's incarnation, kenosis, images and seems to be anticipated by the Father's active generation of the Son, while it's not identical at all because it has these elements of limitation and change of condition, not of nature.
Yeah, and it's just amazing, right, that somebody writing, in the early third century is already sort of grappling with these issues of divine immutability.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just gives the lie to the idea that these were unsophisticated times. These were extremely sophisticated times, which is why it's always great to turn to the church fathers,
Mm-hmm.
because in grappling with, and this is another important issue, they're grappling with the best that non-Christian Greco-Roman philosophy and religious thinking, the best that it has to offer. And so they're not just combating error, they're also,
Hmm.
in a sense, trying to retrieve something of the spoils of Egypt, it seems to me. I mean, it's got to be the
Absolutely.
case, right, that Origen in going after Kenosis probably also sees something in Kelsey's critique that has merit and that therefore has to be dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, he's trying to preserve a real incarnation with which Celsus has no interest in. Platonists of the strict sense
Yeah.
are going to have no interest in that. But he does affirm that he doesn't say, "Oh yeah, sure, the incarnation denies the immutability of God." You're right. You're just wrong to think that incarnation is bad. No, he wants it both ways, and he has to struggle
Yeah.
in a big way to have it both ways, which is not easy. To uphold the real immutability of God and the reality of the incarnation. So he definitely takes the critique seriously and thinks that there are elements of truth in the critique. And as you said, despoiling the Egyptians, there are elements of truth
There
in
are.
these non-Christian traditions which we have to hold on to.
I always want to remind people too, when they start talking about how Balthasar's theology or modern Trinitarian theologies go against the immutability of God. I always like to remind people that they tend to be using the word immutability in a univocal way without any concept of analogical, predication that when we say God is immutable, it comes under the realm of analogy, just like when we call God love or God Father, whatever. So my point is we don't fully understand what an immutable God actually is precisely in his immutability, right?
Yeah, it is a very apophatic notion. I mean, it just literally is a negation. It's a negation of mutability and of change. And when you first say the idea that God's immutable, someone might think, oh, the God, that means the God's boring. To
Yeah,
live is to change. And so is God not living? Well, I mean, you have in the patristic tradition in Origen and all the way through, I mean, all of these theologians are concerned with this. They don't want to say that immutability is lifelessness. And I think Origen has a great way of showing how the life of God is active. It's pure actuality in the Thomistic sense. Of course, he doesn't say that directly, but he's
yeah.
grappling with the same problem and showing how there's something active and living and dynamic in God's immutability as God's immutability, which isn't lifelessness. It is as ointment emptied out, so to speak. It is as light and radiance, as mind and word. Um, it's all of these images which indicate procession and vitality and activity in God, which is nevertheless not a substantial change, not diminution or anything like that.
Right, absolutely. That's why Balthasar often said it's we shouldn't refer to God as atemporal. We should refer to God as supra-temporal in the sense that no, he doesn't change, but it's also not as if he now exists in some sort of airless void, like you said, that's boring,
Hmm.
lifeless, and just a realm of negations. Now,
Hmm.
I'm going to go back to the origin now. In your article. You mentioned about half hour ago that there are various Thomistic critiques of the concept of kenosis within the Trinitarian relations. You mentioned Bruce Marshall. I like Bruce, but he's a nice guy and a very smart guy. I have very little time for his version of analytical Thomism. I take more seriously the critique of Father Thomas Joseph White. He's actually just down the road from me here in Rome at the Angelicum. Great guy, smart guy. I knew him when he was brother Thomas Joseph White. That's how old I am. But the essence of his critique, at least in one that you mentioned in your article, is we should not talk about the Father emptying himself into the Son. Rather, we should talk instead of emanation or emptying, we should talk about outpouring. Maybe you could unpack that particular
Hmm.
Thomistic critique a little bit.
Yeah, so In Father White's recent large book, Thomistic Theology of the Trinity, it's called, well, now I'm blanking on the title. It's in the notes.
Yeah.
It's very large. It's absolutely worth reading. It's a tremendous text. Um, as he's negotiating this question of,
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't mean the
no,
Trinity
go for
on the
it.
nature and mystery of the one God from CUA Press.
Yes, great.
Okay, go ahead.
So as he's navigating these questions of Trinitarian kenosis with Balthasar and other thinkers, but especially with Balthasar, he's cautious of the language of emptying for the Trinity itself, for the reasons which I was previously indicating for its indications of limitation and change and suffering. And this is a real concern. I mean, Bulgakov um, actually does at one point liken Trinitarian kenosis to a kind of suffering. What exactly that means, I can't speak on behalf of Bulgakov. He's a difficult thinker, but these are concerns. Um,
You should go
and
down the hall and talk to Jenny Martin at Notre Dame there, who's written a
Yeah,
book.
absolutely. I cited her book there. She has a great section, multiple sections on how Balthasar relates to Bulgakov in general and on this question in
Anyway, I
particular.
interrupted you again. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. So Father White recommends against language of emptying, we should have the more traditional patristic medieval imagery of outpouring. This is more, it's emanationist, expressivist language taken from the Bible in the imagery of Father and Son and of light and radiance, which are classic patristic images, which don't have those connotations of limitation, suffering, and change, but they get you kind of the same thing. And I mentioned Father White's book in the article because Origen, in a very interesting way, kind of allows us to have it both ways by articulating kenosis somewhat paradoxically in expressivist, emanationist terms, rather than simply in those more basic terms which indicate loss and limitation and potentially alteration. So I mentioned White there to suggest that Origen opens up a way that we can have it both ways potentially, and that kenosis can be expressivist and it can be used in an outpouring way rather than in a limitation way.
Yeah, I disagree with it, but it's an important, it's an interesting Thomistic critique because one gets the
Hmm.
sense that Father Thomas. Why do we always say Thomas Joseph White? It's like why don't we just say Father White? But no, it's always TJW, Father Thomas
Hmm.
Joseph White. But anyway, it's an important critique because White he's been involved in dialogue with the Communio school for
Hmm.
decades now, going all the way back to when he was brother Thomas Joseph White. So I do get the sense that the reason why he wants to be very careful, and he is very careful here, in the kind of language that we want to use to describe what Origen is up to. He wants to, in a sense, cut the legs out from underneath the later use of this by modern theologians like von Balthasar, because let's face it, von Balthasar, in speaking of the emptying, the self-emptying, the kenosis of the Father into the Son in the kenosis, he has a very radical sense of just how much of his divinity the Father gives to the Son, and the answer is all of it. And then, of course, the Son returns all of it. So, in some ways, I think Father White thinks that Balthasar, in combating Hegel, he flies too close to the sun and his wings melt, and he,
Hmm.
he gets singed with the Hegelian torch, if you will. Maybe I don't. That's not really dealt with in your article, but maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, in general, I would recommend that interested listeners go to Thomas Joseph White's book, and I mentioned a couple articles, and I also cited Marshall. I think I cited Guy Mancini too, who
Oh,
has
Guy
a
Mancini, yeah.
yeah, he has an interesting article on Hegel and um, modern Trinitarian theology. So yeah, critiques of the Balthasarian position definitely are concerned with the fact that he's getting flying too close to the sun, so to speak. And in an attempt to outwit Hegel, who introduces the idea of Trinitarian kenosis in some way, it's not fully thought out. But kenosis, emptying or ex. So in German, the lexical problem becomes a little bit more difficult. So in the Luther Bibel translation of Philippians 2, the translation of emptying or kanao is the German verb entäusen and its cognate noun entäuserung, which means exteriorization.
Yeah.
So for Hegel, that's a huge term, right? You can look at the science of logic and see his understanding of the interior and exterior, the inner outer dialectic. And of course, this becomes very interesting in later tradition because Kierkegaard is all over this. And he thinks Hegel
Yeah.
gets the inner outer relation totally wrong. But an interesting way that the German language allows this language of exteriorization is equivalent or it's cognate with emptying. And so Balthasar attempts to outwit Hegel in this way, and some are concerned that he does take too much from Hegel and still having this a really robust notion of intratrinitarian kenosis. I don't want to speak too much on behalf of these other great scholars who have written on this, like White, Mancini, Marshall. I have their text in the footnotes. They've written a variety of articles and books on these subjects and related subjects. I don't want to pretend to be able to give a perfect rendition of their views right now, but they are definitely concerned with bringing those elements of change and limitation and loss and depletion, which kenosis seems to signify, and putting them into God, which is what's done seemingly in Hegel in a way, and then in a lot of modern theologians like Eberhard Jungel and other major theologians who are also grappling with the problem of divine immutability.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Cyril Origen in all of this, that I think Balthasar is largely successful in combating Hegel. I don't think he
Hmm.
flies too close to the Hegelian sun. If anything, I think Balthasar is very, very cautious when he has to be and very careful when he has to be. Um, and on the same token, I think that the Thomists are too squeamish. John Betts points this out in his chapter on the humility of God in his latest book and in this article in the New Resource Mod. He doesn't say squeamish, but what he says, look, does the humility does the humility portrayed in the kenosis of the word into the humanity of Jesus, does that show us something about God or not? And the
Hmm.
answer is yes. What the Thomistic critique runs the risk of doing is in a sense, allowing the philosophical tail to wag the Christological or theological dog, because it seems to, and Betts makes this point that they're going to eventually end up severing any linkage between the economic and the immanent trinities, so that we're left with virtually no way of, in a sense, of back engineering what God is
Hmm.
like by taking a look at what Christ is like. So anyway, I'm with Betts and Origen and these other people contra the Thomists in this regard.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that language of back engineering. I'll have to use that more frequently. I think that that's a good term. Um, so yeah, the question of the relation between the immanent trinity and the economic trinity is, from the Balthasarian perspective, at the heart of this. Of course, there's the famous Renarian axiom that the immanent trinity is the economic trinity, and vice versa. That is the thesis or the hypothesis that Balthasar is also engaging with here. So it's not just a question of him appropriating things from Bulgakov, who's influenced in certain ways by Hegel and Schelling. That's one trajectory, but the other very important trajectory is trying to understand the relationship between immanent trinity and economic trinity, and with the Renarian axiom that they're identical. Balthasar doesn't exactly want to say that they're identical in the way that Rahner does. But he does want to see how what we see in the economic trinity, in the economy of salvation, is grounded in the immanent Trinity. And I think if my interpretation of Origen is reasonable and effective and nonviolent hermeneutically, Origen actually does allow us to see how those two are connected and how what we have in the immanent Trinity is an anticipation of the economy without being identical with it. Um, and it kind of it speaks to Balthazar's concerns. I think it can also speak to the Thomistic concerns, right? So Origen doesn't have he doesn't impose these problems of limitation and the Hegelian exteriorization, which seems to leave the interior, the prior interior behind. Um, he doesn't he doesn't speak to those concerns. He predates them by centuries, but he does show us a way that the immanent Trinity anticipates and grounds the economic Trinity without being identical to it. And I think that that gets to Balthazar what he wants, and it can also speak to concerns with Balthazar, which are often coming from Thomistic thinkers, that we will be imposing uniquely economic things onto the immanent Trinity. So those uniquely economic realities would be suffering, limitation, the change of condition, which I indicated earlier, which don't belong in God. Um, and so, yeah, I think Origen, or at least my interpretation of Origen, can hopefully be something mediating these two positions, and they can have something in common.
Yeah, well, that's brilliant. I think that's absolutely true. I'm not disagreeing with that. My mind is racing right now a little bit in thinking about the fact that yes, you don't want to simply uh, univocally say, well, what we
Hmm.
see in the economic trinity, that's exactly what God is like. Fortunately, that's not Balthasar's position. It's not Origen's
Right.
position. It's analogical. And one could make a case for it. There is something analogically related in God to what we call suffering. That doesn't involve change, doesn't involve darkness, doesn't involve negation, doesn't involve, all of the negative, sinful aspects of suffering, but
Hmm.
something in a sense supra, in an analogical sense. And so I just think, one of the things it seems to me that the Thomists miss, and that Balthasar and Bulgakov and some of the others get, is that at the heart of the Hegelian problematic is a false sense of transcendence as competitive, a false sense of God's transcendence as so alien as to be alienating, and heteronymous, so heteronymous to us that it comes to us as an exterior that is foreign. Therefore, Hegel sort of immanentizes the entire dadgum thing. And it seems to me that that is Hegel's concern, and the concern of all sort of Catholic modernists and their heresies and so forth, or even if you want to talk Blondel, is with precisely what is this relationship between immanence and transcendence. This is a critical thing that has to be worked out.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that is certainly one of Balthasar's concerns with Hegel, who, I mean, you read some of Hegel's works and they seem from a theological perspective just so exciting, and it's like a theological intervention into modernity. So he critiques modern philosophy paradigmatically in Kant for worshiping at the altar of the unknown God, right? They've
Yeah.
evaporated, they've taken all content out of God, they've rendered God unknowable. Um, and as he says in the prologue to the Encyclopedia, they've worshipped at the altar of the unknown God, invoking acts. And so Hegel is very interested in having us know God, and this is a project of great theological promise, right? And so theologians can or do and should be interested and excited about that very interested intervention in the history of modern philosophy, where you have theological complaints um, from a major philosopher about what the trajectory of modern philosophy has done to God, to the knowability of God, and to the transcendence of God. Um, Hegel, then, he does have this a certain understanding of the transcendence of God, of the divine idea. Um, but as he is working out the ways in which God is knowable, yeah, as you mentioned, he immanentizes the whole thing, not to speak too generally, but it becomes apparent for Hegel as you go through the course of whether it's the logic of the phenomenology of spirit, and most clearly in a Christian theological or religious lens, the philosophy of religion, lectures on the philosophy of religion, that the principle of historical development and of logical development, the divine idea is God. And when God exteriorizes himself in creation, he exteriorizes himself, so to speak, as creation. And so there's that identity of the divine idea with the historical development of the world. And so both Balthasar and Bulgakov and Shivara and all these major modern Catholic thinkers, which absolutely includes the Thomistic theologians we've been talking about, and it would also include earlier Thomistic theologians of Balthasar's day and of Shivara's day. Um, they are all in agreement that it's that understanding of transcendence and immanence where the supposedly transcendent God totally empties himself into the world to such an extent that there's a real identity of himself with the world, um, in a kind of Spinozist way. We're against that, and we're trying to configure transcendence and immanence, creation and God in a way which avoids that, while also responding to the exact same modern problematic that Hegel responded to, that this
Yep.
trajectory of modern philosophy has rendered God unknowable, which is to say meaningless. And we can't have that. So you have a shared project among these different thinkers, divergence within that project, definitely, but they have a common enemy, so to speak, and a common concern.
They do. Absolutely, which is why they're issues that have to be taken up. But the value of your article, to return then to your piece, is precisely to show that these concerns of modern Orthodox, Catholic Trinitarian theologians, that those concerns are not complete and utter novelties. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, meditating upon the relationship between the economic and the immanent Trinity with a specific eye towards kenosis is not foreign to the tradition. It's not some sort of modern Hegelian
Mm-hmm.
importation that has to be just rejected to court. And so that's, I really, really value your article for in a sense making this connection. Now, along those lines, and once again, I don't want to throw you a curveball that you weren't expecting,
Mm-hmm.
so feel free not to say I don't know. Uh, are there other church fathers other than Origen who now also talk about this same relationship?
Yeah. Um, so in the original version of this paper, I had planned to have a section on Cyril.
Of
Origin
Alexandria?
is,
Yeah.
yes, or yeah, sorry, Origin, Cyril of Alexandria, of course, Origen's Alexandrine successor in many ways. Only Cyril outmatches Origen in terms of frequency of use of the language of kenosis. So one of the sources that I used in my composition of this essay was Michael McGree's dissertation at Notre Dame, actually, on kenosis in patristic theology. And he notes something very interesting, that typically the fathers avoid this language. He compares Origen to Gregory of Nyssa. So he sees ways in which Gregory of Nyssa is, in his reading, kind of avoiding that language, even where it would make a lot of sense. He's avoiding, not per se avoiding it, but he is using that kind of language a lot less than Origen. Origen uses it a lot, which is surprising given all the other patristic theologians, and he stands out for that reason. But he's not number one on the kind of the kenosis rankings. Cyril is number one. He uses it most of all, and of course, he's using it against Nestorius, who
Right.
doesn't have that real incarnation. So Nestorius also very concerned about the immutability of God, the idea of God becoming flesh, just it can't happen. And so Nestorius deconstructs the idea of incarnation, and he doesn't have a real incarnation. Cyril, contra Nestorius, reads the Bible literally. John says the word became flesh. That's what it means, right? And so he's constantly quoting the word became flesh and the word emptied himself. These are the texts that he's quoting all the time, trying to understand how that incarnation is real, and it's not play acting. It is a hypostatic union. It is a personal union of the word with his humanity, contra Nestorius. So, yeah, Cyril uses this language a lot. Does Cyril allow us to see the connection between the canonic incarnation and the Trinity? And I could not come up with anything which was not hermeneutically violent or overly
Yeah.
creative. He doesn't correlate those two questions directly in the way that Origen does, at least not that I could find. I would have to do a deeper dive into his Trinitarian theology. But at least Cyril doesn't have that stark language that Origen has of the Son by this very emptying, displaying the fullness of the Godhead. And so those kinds of locutions were my door into Origen and the question of Trinitarian kenosis. And I don't think, or at least I couldn't find them elsewhere, not even in Cyril, who actually
Yeah.
outmatches Origen in frequency of usage.
Of course, and after Nestorius, and Cyril, and gets vindicated at Ephesus,
Mhm.
Theotokos, all that, then of course certain Monophysite tendencies creep in. Chalcedon has to come and fix things, and then you get Maximus the Confessor, and so the it seems like the patristic focus is not yet really, unlike an Origen, not yet really about connecting the dots between the economic and the immanent trinities. They're more simply concerned, if you want to put it this sort of in a vulgar way, they're concerned with the mechanics of the incarnation. How
Mhm.
how and what does all of this mean in terms of the humanity and the divinity coming together in the
Mhm.
hypostatic union? They're more concerned with that, I think, than with extrapolating
Yes.
into Trinitarian speculation.
Yeah, that's definitely right. I mean, if you're wondering how the incarnation reflects the divine life, well, you have to nail down what exactly incarnation means. And that's their primary concern. That is the basic Christian message. All of these questions about Trinitarian kenosis are very interesting. They're very exciting. A lot of literature is written on it. Um, they are theologumena. They're elements of theological disputation. Um, and their common efforts in different ways to understand the basic message of the incarnation. And that's what the patristic theologians are getting at, is the essential Christian message that God became man.
Yeah, and what your article does, and others like it, is to show, though, that at the very least, what modern Trinitarian theologians like Balthasar are doing is at least grounded and rooted in those patristic speculations. The
Mhm.
fathers themselves may not have connected all the dots, but that doesn't mean that the dots aren't there to connect. And your article does a good job of showing, well, Origen has this dot and has this dot. He doesn't explicitly connect them, but actually he does. And here's how.
Yeah. And there's something uniquely modern about the question because it's a kind of transcendental question, right?
Yeah.
And we're not talking about transcendental philosophy as we're not investigating conditions in the human subject for knowledge. We're kind of investigating the conditions in God and the divine Trinitarian subject for what we see in history and in the economy. So in an interesting way, I think the problematic is opened up and made possible by modern transcendental philosophy in an interesting way, and as a kind of quasi-transcendental form of inquiry. And when we approach the tradition from that perspective, we can see how someone like Origen, even though he doesn't have that conceptual apparatus, allows us to see how he's doing something very similar. And there was one quotation from Balthasar that I had in here. This I quote on the bottom of 686. He says, and this is in Mysterium Pascale, the ultimate presupposition of the kenosis is the selflessness of the persons in the intratrinitarian life of love. So that statement has two parts. The first is the language of ultimate presupposition, and then the second is the more material content of the selflessness of the Trinitarian persons. It's the latter element that a lot of the literature is devoted to, and asking what exactly is that selflessness? What exactly could kenosis mean and couldn't mean in a Trinitarian context? I think not necessarily the more interesting part, but the more primary part is that first element of the sentence as the ultimate presupposition. So there you see the kind of transcendental inquiry. I think Origen allows us to see how the Father's generation of the Son is a presupposition. It is a kind of ground for the condition of the possibility of the later economic manifestation of that in the incarnation. And I think that is a thesis which could warrant widespread agreement, potentially. I'll never claim widespread agreement for anything, but my focus on Origen as that presupposition, we still have to navigate exactly what do we mean when we say that these two realities are analogical? What kind of analogy are we talking about? What do we make of the dissimilarities, those elements of limitation and depletion, which are in that concept of kenosis? What do we make of it? I think prior to that, we can note, along with these modern theologians and through Origen in an interesting and perhaps unexpected way, that the Trinitarian original reality, whether you call it an original or kenosis, but just to speak more broadly, that original reality is a presupposition, is the condition for the reality of the incarnation. And this is a kind of explication or a zooming in, so to speak, and a broadening or a deepening rather of a very classic Thomistic axiom, that the mission of the Trinity, of the persons of the Trinity, of the Son and the Spirit, is grounded in the procession, and creation is grounded in the Trinitarian processions. So these forms of inquiry are in the tradition. I've highlighted Origen. We can also see Thomistic anticipation of these kinds of questions. Now we're applying it to a new question, and hopefully with Origen, we've come upon something.
And I think Maximus the Confessor looms large in these discussions too. But anyway, we're a little over an hour into this conversation, so we should probably just go ahead and wrap this up. I would like to. I am going to be at Notre Dame this fall with my wife in November at the big Catholic Woodstock, I call it, the conference.
Yeah.
Nicholas, will you be there?
I absolutely will. Yes.
So okay,
and it's on a great subject of tradition.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to link up.
Absolutely.
And have a conversation. I'm looking forward to that. There was something. I can't. We're just 4 or 5 days out from the election of Pope Leo. I'm just wondering what are the shock waves wearing off in South Bend? I mean, South Bend lives in the shadow of Chicago.
That's right.
There must have been some reverberations there under the dome.
Yeah, I've actually been in St. Louis the last few days.
Okay.
So I just got back last night. But yes, I can't wait to go to Chicago. Of course, there's all these anecdotes which have been communicated to the Pope I saw yesterday or 2 days ago about churches in America and in Chicago, especially Holy Name Cathedral, being much better attended than they were a week ago, which is very exciting. And yeah, the idea of an American Pope was surprising. The idea of a Midwestern Pope is just fascinating and tremendous. I mean,
That's
I said
right.
I'm from St. Louis.
Nebraska, so yes,
Yeah.
A nice boy from the Midwest. That's
absolutely. I can't wait to go to a Bears game wearing a Leo number 14 jersey. And as a St. Louisan, of course, I'm very happy that he's not a Cubs fan and he's a White Sox fan instead. And
yes, he is a White Sox fan, we are told. And there's video of him at a White Sox baseball.
That's right. I can't believe they found that.
I know.
But the modern world.
Just living proof. Be careful what you put on the interwebs because it's there.
Exactly.
All right. Well, do you have any last words for the audience before we sign off, Samuel?
My last words? Well, if you're interested in the article, it is, as Larry mentioned, relatively short. I think it's also free to download on Communia's website.
Oh, I was going to
Um,
ask you, I didn't check. Is it one of the articles that they link that you can download?
I think it is, yeah. And if it's not, you can send me an email or like a Twitter DM or something, and I can send it to you. Um, but
Yeah,
thanks for
very good.
listening and thank you for reading if
Okay,
you're
well, it's a great
interested.
article, Samuel. And good luck on your dissertation.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully our paths will cross.
Yes.
And thanks again, too, for everybody for watching. Bye now.